My name is Eleanor, and I am 68 years old, and 3 weeks ago I found the one thing I had made with my own 2 hands, stitch by stitch, thread by thread, over 4 months of sleepless nights, sitting at the bottom of a garbage can behind my son's house, soaked through with coffee grounds and rain. And I want you to understand that this was not just a blanket, this was the last thing I would ever make for my husband's granddaughter, because my hands don't work right anymore. The arthritis has twisted my fingers into claws that can barely hold a fork some mornings, let alone knitting needles, and I had known, even as I cast on that first row, that this would be my final gift, my last act of love stitched into yarn, and I had hidden something inside it, something so precious that when my son called me sobbing 2 days later, his voice cracking apart on the phone, asking, "Mom, what was inside it? What did you put in there?" I could barely speak through my own tears long enough to tell him, but I am getting ahead of myself, because to understand why finding that blanket in the trash broke something inside me that I am not sure will ever fully heal, you need to understand who I am and what that blanket meant, and you need to understand my daughter-in-law Vanessa, and the war that had been quietly building between us since the day my son Michael brought her home 4 years ago and told me, with stars in his eyes, that he was going to marry her, and I smiled and I hugged her and I told myself that whatever unease I felt was just an old woman's jealousy, just a mother struggling to let go of her only son, and for years I convinced myself that was all it was, that the chill I felt whenever Vanessa looked at me was something I was imagining, something I was manufacturing, because I couldn't bear to share Michael with anyone. But deep down, in the part of myself I never wanted to listen to, I knew better. I knew that Vanessa saw me as an obstacle, as competition, as someone standing between her and the version of family she wanted to build, one without my fingerprints on it, one where I existed only at the edges, invited to dinners out of obligation and photographed out of politeness, but never truly welcomed in. And when she got pregnant last spring, when Michael called me screaming with joy, when he told me I was going to be a grandmother for the first time in my life, I wept for an hour straight. I wept because after burying my husband Robert 3 years ago, after sitting alone in that quiet house every single night wondering what was left for me to live for, God had handed me a reason, a real and true reason, to keep going, and I decided right then, sitting on my kitchen floor with the phone still warm in my hand, that I would knit that baby a blanket, not just any blanket, but the softest, warmest, most carefully made blanket that these old broken hands could produce. And I drove myself to 3 different stores to find the perfect yarn, a pale buttery yellow, because Michael and Vanessa didn't want to know the gender, and I sat every single night under my reading lamp, ignoring the burning ache climbing up through my knuckles and wrists, because I knew in my bones, that this would likely be the last big project my hands could manage, that the disease eating away at my joints would not let me do this again, and so every stitch became a prayer. Every row became a piece of myself I was weaving into something that would wrap around my grandchild on cold nights long after I was gone. And hidden in the very center of that blanket, tucked into a small hand-sewn pocket that I lined and stitched shut so carefully that you would never know it was there, unless you were looking for it, I placed something that I had kept locked in my jewelry box for 40 years, something Robert had given me on the night Michael was born. Something I had always planned to pass down to my first grandchild, and I told no one it was there, not even Michael, because I wanted it to be a discovery, a little piece of magic that Vanessa would find one day while washing the blanket or folding it, a secret connection between 3 generations she would stumble upon and understand just how deeply this family had already wrapped itself around a baby who hadn't even been born yet. And when the blanket was finished, when I held it up to the light and saw every imperfect, hard-won stitch glowing pale gold, I cried again, right there alone in my living room, because I knew this was the most important thing I had made in years, maybe the most important thing I had ever made. And 3 days later I drove it over to Michael and Vanessa's house myself, my hands trembling not from the arthritis this time but from nerves, hoping, praying, that this gift would finally be the bridge, the thing that closed the distance Vanessa had always kept between us. And when she opened the box and lifted the blanket out, she smiled, she actually smiled, and said it was beautiful, and thanked me, and for one single evening I let myself believe that everything between us was finally going to be okay, that I had found my way in, that this baby was going to heal whatever had never quite settled right between her mother and me. I had no idea. None at all, that 3 weeks later I would be standing in the rain behind their house, staring down into a garbage can at that same blanket, torn slightly at one seam, soaked through and ruined, thrown away like it meant nothing, like the hundreds of hours and the secret I had sewn inside it meant absolutely nothing at all. And it would take my son's broken voice on the phone to make me realize that what I'd find at the bottom of that trash can wasn't the end of this story, it was only the beginning. I need to take you back to that rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after I had handed over that blanket with my whole heart wrapped inside it, because I had not planned on being behind Michael and Vanessa's house that day at all. I had only driven over because Michael texted me asking if I could drop off a casserole dish I had borrowed for Thanksgiving, and since he and Vanessa were both at work and the baby, my granddaughter Willow, was with a sitter, I figured I would let myself in through the side gate the way I always had, the way Robert and I used to when Michael was still a boy bringing girlfriends home for the first time. And as I walked up the little stone path toward the kitchen door, I noticed the garbage cans sitting out by the fence, lids slightly askew, because the collection truck must have come and gone that morning, or so I thought. And I don't know what made me look, I truly don't. Maybe it was some old instinct mothers carry with them their whole lives. Some sixth sense that tells you when something is wrong before your mind has caught up to your body. But I glanced down into the open can as I passed it, and there, right on top of a torn trash bag, sitting in a puddle of what looked like old coffee and wet cardboard, was a small corner of pale buttery yellow yarn. And my heart just stopped. It simply stopped beating in my chest, because I told myself immediately, no, that can't be it. That can't possibly be the blanket. There must be some mistake. Maybe it's scrap yarn, maybe it's something else entirely, but my hands were already reaching down before my mind had given them permission. My fingers, aching and stiff as they always are these days, closing around soaked wool, and as I pulled it free from beneath the wet cardboard and the crushed remains of a cereal box, I felt my knees nearly buckle right there on the pavement, because it was my blanket. It was the blanket I had knitted stitch by stitch through 4 months of burning joints and sleepless nights, the blanket I had poured my whole heart and a piece of my husband's memory into, and it was ruined. The yarn was matted and dark with moisture. There was a tear along one edge where it looked like it had gotten caught on something sharp. Coffee grounds were pressed into the fibers in ugly brown smears. And I stood there in the light rain just holding it, staring down at what used to be the most beautiful thing I had made in years. And I could not make sense of what I was looking at. My mind kept trying to construct innocent explanations. Maybe it got stained beyond saving, and they didn't want to tell me. Maybe there was an accident. Maybe the dog got into something and ruined it, and they were embarrassed. I stood there inventing kindnesses for people who apparently felt none for me, because the alternative, the truth that was sitting right there in my hands, was too painful to hold alongside the blanket itself. And then my fingers brushed against the small pocket I had sewn into the underside, the one holding the secret I had never told anyone about, and my whole body went cold, because the pocket was still sewn shut, still intact, meaning whatever had happened to this blanket, whoever had thrown it away, had never even discovered what was hidden inside it, had never known, had never cared enough to look, had simply seen a stained, torn piece of yarn work and tossed it into the trash without a second thought, without wondering whether it mattered to anyone, without wondering whether an old woman's aching hands had spent 4 months making it. And something in me broke in that moment, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, deep crack somewhere behind my ribs, and I remember standing there in the rain holding this ruined blanket against my chest like it was a wounded animal, and I did not go inside. I could not make myself knock on that door and act normal. I could not stand across the kitchen counter from Vanessa and pretend I did not know what I now knew. So I got back into my car, blanket still clutched against me, soaking through my coat, and I drove home in silence, tears running down my face the entire way, not even bothering to wipe them. And when I got home, I laid the blanket out across my kitchen table under the bright overhead light, and I just looked at it, at the ruined stitches, at the tear, at the stains, and I thought about every single night I had sat there knitting through the pain, telling myself it was worth it, telling myself this baby would grow up wrapped in her grandmother's love, and I felt something I am ashamed to admit. I felt a flash of pure rage rise up through my grief, hot and sudden, because this was not carelessness, this was not an accident. Somewhere deep down I already understood that, and it was that evening, sitting at my table with the ruined blanket still spread out before me, that my phone rang, and I saw Michael's name on the screen, and something in my stomach dropped because I could tell from the very first ring that this was not going to be an ordinary call. And when I answered, before I could even say hello, I heard my son, my grown 34-year-old son, sobbing on the other end of the line so hard he could barely form words, and the first thing he managed to choke out, his voice breaking apart completely, was my name, followed by a question that would change everything I understood about what had happened in that house. A question I was not ready to answer. Not that night, not with my own heart still shattered on my kitchen table. "Mom," Michael said again, his voice cracking so badly I almost didn't recognize it, this deep, steady voice that had comforted me through his father's funeral, this voice that had once been so calm and so grounded, now sounding like it belonged to a frightened little boy, and he kept repeating my name like he was trying to steady himself. "Mom, Mom, are you there?" And I told him, "Yes, I'm here, sweetheart, what's wrong?" And there was this long, horrible pause on the line, just the sound of him breathing hard, trying to pull himself together enough to speak. And finally he asked me the question that I had been dreading without even realizing I'd been dreading it. He asked, "What was inside the blanket? Mom, what did you put in there?" And my entire body went numb, because in that instant I understood two things at once. I understood that he had somehow found out about the pocket, about the secret I had sewn inside, and I understood that whatever had happened in that house that evening had been bad enough to make my son, a grown man, a successful contractor who had handled fires and injuries and financial disasters without ever once crying in front of me, completely fall apart. And I asked him, my own voice shaking now, "Michael, what happened? Where is Willow? Is the baby okay?" Because that was my first thought, my only thought, was that something had happened to that baby. And he said, "No, Willow's fine, she's fine. But Mom, you need to tell me, please, what was inside that blanket." And so I told him. I told him about the pocket I had sewn into the underside, about the small velvet pouch I had tucked inside it, and about what was in that pouch. And as I spoke I heard him let out this sound, this raw, wounded sound, half sob and half gasp, and he said, "Mom, I found it. I found the blanket in the garbage can behind the house, and there was a tear in it, and something fell out onto the ground, and Mom, it was Dad's ring. It was Dad's wedding ring." And hearing him say it out loud, hearing my son confirm what I already knew in my bones, broke something open in both of us at exactly the same moment, because that ring, that plain gold band that Robert had worn on his hand for 41 years, the ring I had slipped off his finger myself in the hospital the night he died, the ring I had kept locked away for 3 years, unable to look at it without collapsing, that ring had been my final gift, the truest piece of my heart, hidden inside a pocket that I had planned for Vanessa or Michael to discover one day, a quiet message that said this baby was loved not just by me, but by a grandfather she would never get to meet, a piece of continuity, a thread connecting 3 generations, and instead of being discovered with joy, with tears of the good kind, it had been found lying in a puddle of garbage water on a cracked driveway. And Michael told me through his sobbing that he had come home early to grab tools for a job and noticed the trash can lid was open, and he almost hadn't looked either, except he saw a flash of gold catching the porch light, and when he bent down and realized what he was looking at, when he realized it was his father's wedding ring sitting in a pile of coffee grounds and wet paper, he said he just sat down right there on the driveway and didn't move for 10 minutes. He said he kept turning the ring over and over in his fingers trying to understand how it had ended up there, and then he saw the blanket itself, further down in the can, and put the pieces together, and I asked him, my voice barely a whisper now, "Michael, does Vanessa know you found it?" And there was another long silence, longer this time, heavier, and finally he said, "She's the one who threw it away, Mom. She told me herself. She said the blanket was getting in the way in Willow's room. She said it didn't match the nursery theme, she said it looked cheap, and I asked her why she didn't just give it back to you or donate it, and she said," and here his voice cracked again so badly I could barely make out the words, "she said she didn't think it mattered, she said it was just yarn, and I sat there in my kitchen with the ruined blanket still spread out in front of me, and I felt this strange, quiet stillness settle over me, not calm exactly, but something past the initial shock, something colder and more clear-eyed, because for 4 years I had told myself I was imagining the distance Vanessa kept between us. I had told myself I was being an oversensitive old woman, a jealous mother who couldn't let go. But hearing my son say those words out loud, hearing him confirm that his wife had looked at 4 months of my aching, arthritic hands laboring over yarn, had looked at the last big handmade gift I would likely ever give, had looked at it, and called it just yarn, something cheap, something in the way, made every uneasy feeling I'd had over the past 4 years snap into painfully sharp focus, and I asked Michael the question that had been building inside me since I pulled that blanket out of the trash can, the question that I think, deep down, I already knew the answer to, and would change the course of everything that happened next in our family. I asked him, Michael, is this the first time, or has she done this before? Michael didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than any words could have, because my son has never in his life been someone who hesitates when the answer is simply no, and I sat there with the phone pressed hard against my ear, listening to him breathe, listening to him try to find some way to explain himself, and finally he said, so quietly I almost missed it, Mom, there's some stuff I never told you. And my stomach dropped straight through the kitchen floor. Because in that one sentence I understood that whatever I was about to hear had been happening for a long time, hidden from me, carried alone by my son the way children sometimes carry things to protect their parents from worry, and he began to talk, slowly at first, like he was peeling back a layer of skin he'd kept sealed shut for years, and he told me about the photo album, the one I had made for their wedding, hours spent selecting pictures of Robert and me from our own wedding, pictures of Michael as a baby, pictures meant to show Vanessa that she was marrying into a family with history, with roots, with love that had weathered decades, and he told me that album had gotten lost during their move into the new house 18 months ago, that Vanessa said a box must have fallen off the truck, and I remembered how devastated I'd felt at the time, how I told myself things get lost during moves, it happens, don't make it into something it isn't, but Michael's voice grew heavier as he continued, and he told me about the hand, me, down rocking chair that had been mine when he was a baby, the one I'd refinished myself and given to them for the nursery, gone within 2 months, replaced with something from a catalog, Vanessa telling him the old chair creaked too loudly and might wake the baby, and he told me about birthday cards I'd sent that he later found unopened in a recycling bin, about a recipe box of his grandmother's, my own mother's handwriting on every card, that had simply vanished from the kitchen one day. And as he listed these things out one after another, I felt something horrible crystallizing in my chest, not surprise exactly, because some quiet, wounded part of me had sensed pieces of this all along, but the devastating clarity of finally seeing the whole shape of something I had only ever felt in fragments, and I asked him, my voice trembling, why didn't you tell me any of this? And he broke down again, harder this time, and he said, because I didn't want you to hate her, Mom, because I love her, and I love our life together, and I kept thinking if I just gave it time, if I just talked to her gently enough, she'd understand how much you mean to me, how much your things mean to our family. But every time I brought it up she'd get so hurt, she'd cry and say I was choosing you over her, that I was making her feel like she'd never be enough for this family, and I didn't know what to do, so I just stopped bringing it up. I told myself it was small stuff, I told myself it didn't matter as much as keeping peace in my own house, and hearing him say that broke my heart in an entirely new way, because I understood in that moment that my son had spent years being quietly torn in half, trying to protect a marriage he loved while slowly, piece by piece, losing every physical thread that connected him to the family that raised him, and Vanessa had done this so carefully, so gradually, that no single incident on its own seemed enough to justify outrage, a lost album here, a returned chair there, each one explainable, each one forgivable in isolation, and only now, only when laid end to end, did the pattern reveal itself for what it actually was, a slow, deliberate erasure. And I asked him the question I was most afraid to ask, Michael, do you think she did it on purpose? The blanket, I mean. Do you think she knew how much it meant to me? And he was quiet again, and then he said something that I don't think I will ever forget for as long as I live. He said, Mom, I don't think she even had to think about it. I think somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing your things as things that matter at all. I think she spent so long deciding you're a threat that she doesn't even see the cruelty anymore. She just sees clutter. And I sat there in my kitchen, the ruined blanket still spread in front of me under the bright light. Robert's ring, which Michael had promised to bring over that very night, resting somewhere in my son's pocket a few miles away. And I realized that this was no longer just about a blanket, or even about a ring. This had become about whether my son was going to keep protecting a piece that was slowly costing him his entire family history, and whether I had the strength left in me, at 68 years old, with hands that could barely hold a needle anymore, to finally say out loud what I had swallowed for 4 long years. Michael came over that night, just past 9, still in his work clothes, his eyes red and swollen, and he pulled Robert's ring from his jacket pocket and pressed it into my palm without a word, and I closed my fingers around it and just stood there in my doorway holding my son while he cried into my shoulder the way he hadn't done since he was maybe 7 years old. And when we finally sat down at my kitchen table, the ruined blanket still lying there between us like some kind of evidence at a trial, he told me he had already called Vanessa from the driveway before he even came inside, and he had told her that he knew, that he had found the ring, that he had talked to me, and he said her reaction had frightened him, not guilt, not shame, but a kind of cold, clipped defensiveness, as if he were the one who had done something wrong by looking too closely at the trash, and he told me she'd said, "So what, your mother's going to make me feel guilty for cleaning my own house now?" And something about hearing those words secondhand, spoken so carelessly about the most painful moment of my recent life, lit a fire in me that I hadn't felt in years, and I told Michael, gently but firmly, that I needed to speak with Vanessa myself, not through him, not as a messenger carrying words back and forth between 2 women who loved him, but directly, honestly, the way adults are supposed to handle things. And he looked terrified at the thought. He said, "Mom, please, let me handle it. I don't want this to turn into a war." And I took his hand, his grown hand that used to be so small in mine, and I said, "Michael, it already is a war, sweetheart. It's just one where only one side has been fighting." And 2 days later, Vanessa came to my house alone. Michael had arranged it, and I watched her walk up my front path with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw set in a way that told me she had already decided this conversation was an attack she needed to survive rather than a conversation at all. And I invited her in, offered her tea, which she declined, and we sat across from each other in my living room, the same living room where I had cried tears of joy the night the blanket was finished. And I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her. I simply laid the blanket across the coffee table between us, still stained, still torn, and I told her what was inside it. I told her about Robert, about the night Michael was born, about the ring that had been on his hand for 41 years, about the quiet hope I'd had that she would find it herself one day and understand how deeply this family already loved her daughter. And I watched her face as I spoke, watched something flicker there, something that might have been the first honest emotion I had seen from her in 4 years. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "I didn't know." And her voice cracked slightly, and for one moment I almost let myself soften completely, until she continued, "But Eleanor, you have to understand. Everything in that house always feels like it has to make room for you. Your photos, your furniture, your traditions. I feel like I'm raising my daughter inside a museum of your family instead of building something of my own." And I sat with that for a moment, because underneath the excuse, underneath what still felt to me like a justification for cruelty, there was something true, something I needed to actually hear, a genuine fear of being erased herself, of never feeling like enough, of building a life in a house that still seemed to belong to someone else's memories. And I told her, honestly, that I understood that fear, that I remembered feeling something similar myself decades ago when I married into Robert's family. But I told her there is a difference between building your own space and quietly destroying someone else's, that she did not have to throw away my history to make room for her own, that families are not pies with a fixed number of slices, that love does not run out. And I told her, my voice steady but firm in a way it had never been with her before, that whatever she felt about me personally, my things, my gifts, the physical threads connecting Willow to a grandfather she'd never meet, were not casualties she was entitled to sacrifice in a war. I hadn't even known we were fighting, and I watched her sit with that, watched her arms slowly uncross, watched the defensiveness in her posture crack, just slightly, and she looked down at the ruined blanket between us. And I saw her hand reach out and touch the torn seam, gently, almost reverently, as if she were only now, for the first time, really seeing it. And she looked up at me with tears in her eyes and asked a question that told me this conversation, however painful, however overdue, had finally cracked something open between us. She asked, "Is there any way to fix it?" I looked at Vanessa sitting across from me, tears finally spilling down her face, no longer the guarded, defensive woman who had walked into my house an hour earlier, and I told her the truth that no, not really, not fully. The blanket itself could never be exactly what it was. Wool doesn't forget being soaked in garbage water, stains like that don't simply wash away. Some of the stitches had pulled and frayed beyond repair, and I watched her face fall at that, watched her absorb the weight of what had actually been lost. Not just an object but time, 4 months of my failing hands working through pain she would never fully understand. And then I told her that fixing the blanket exactly wasn't really the point anyway, that some things in life aren't meant to be restored to what they were. They're meant to be transformed into something new, and I asked her if she trusted me enough to let me try something, and she nodded, and over the following weeks, something shifted quietly between us. I brought the blanket to a woman I know, a quilter 2 towns over who specializes in taking damaged textiles and turning them into something else entirely. And together we decided to cut the salvageable pieces of that yellow yarn, the parts untouched by stain or tear, and incorporate them into a small quilted keepsake, a square panel that could hang in Willow's room. And I asked Vanessa if she wanted to help choose the design, and to my surprise, she said yes. And one Saturday afternoon she came to my house and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once spread out that ruined blanket and wept. And this time we sat together going through fabric swatches, and I told her more stories about Robert while we worked, about the year he proposed to me with a ring he'd saved 4 months' wages for, about the night Michael was born and how Robert cried harder than I did, and I watched Vanessa listen, really listen, in a way she never had before, and somewhere in that afternoon, without either of us announcing it, something between us began to soften into something that had never quite existed until then, not friendship exactly, not yet, but the beginning of understanding, the recognition that we were not actually enemies competing over the same small territory of Michael's love, but 2 women who loved the same people and had simply never learned how to make room for each other. And when the keepsake panel was finished, a small patchwork square stitched from the surviving threads of that yellow yarn, bordered in soft cream fabric, with Robert's ring sewn securely into a little glass, fronted pocket at its center, visible now rather than hidden, meant to be seen and known rather than discovered by accident. Vanessa was the one who suggested we hang it above Willow's crib herself, and I stood in that nursery and watched my daughter-in-law hammer a small nail into the wall with far more determination than the task required, and hang that little piece of salvaged history where her daughter would see it every single day of her childhood. And I felt something inside my chest that I hadn't felt in years, not quite peace, grief doesn't fully disappear like that, but something adjacent to it. Something that let me breathe a little easier. And Michael, watching from the doorway, had tears running down his face again, but this time they were different tears. And afterward the 3 of us sat in Willow's nursery while she napped, talking quietly, and Vanessa told me, unprompted, that she wanted to start over, that she'd spent years so afraid of being erased by my history that she'd never stopped to consider she was hurting the people she loved most in the process. And I told her I understood fear like that better than she knew, and that I wasn't asking her to build her life around my memories, only to leave room for them alongside her own. And slowly, over the months that followed, things did change, not perfectly, not without occasional friction. Old habits and old wounds don't dissolve overnight, but genuinely, meaningfully. Birthday cards started getting opened. Dinners started feeling less like obligations and more like invitations. And one afternoon, nearly a year later, Vanessa called me herself, her voice warm in a way it had never been before, and asked if I would consider teaching her to knit, because she wanted to make something for Willow's 2nd birthday, something with her own hands, something that would mean as much to her daughter as that first blanket had meant to me. And I sat on the phone crying happy tears for the first time in longer than I could remember, and I told her yes, of course, I would love nothing more. And now, when I look back on that terrible rainy afternoon, standing in the rain holding a ruined blanket pulled from a garbage can, I understand that it wasn't actually the ending of anything. It was the beginning of the family finally becoming whole, not because a blanket was destroyed, but because destroying it forced all of us to finally say out loud the things we had been too afraid to say. And Willow, now toddling around her nursery beneath that small patchwork square holding her great-grandfather's ring, will grow up knowing exactly what was inside it, not because I hid it away in secret, but because her mother, her grandmother, and her father finally learned how to build something together instead of quietly tearing each other apart. And that, I think, is the truest inheritance any of us could have ever given her. It's been 2 years now since I stood in the rain holding that ruined blanket, and I want to tell you how this story truly ends, or rather how it keeps beginning again, because last month Willow turned 3 and Vanessa, my daughter-in-law who once threw away 4 months of my aching hands' work without a second thought, stood in her kitchen and handed her daughter a small, imperfect, lovingly lopsided scarf, the first thing she had ever knitted with her own 2 hands, taught stitch by stitch at my kitchen table over the past year, and I watched Willow wrap that scarf around her stuffed rabbit and declare it the softest thing in the whole world. And Vanessa caught my eye across the room and smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile that carries history in it, now instead of guardedness, and I thought about how far we'd traveled to reach that small, ordinary, beautiful moment, and I want to tell you something else too. Something I didn't fully understand until much later, which is that Vanessa eventually told me, on one of our Saturday afternoons with yarn between us, that she'd grown up in a house where her own mother's things had never been allowed to matter, where her stepfather had slowly erased every trace of her late father from their home, photographs taken down, furniture replaced, until she was 12 years old and could barely remember what her father's handwriting looked like. And she told me that somewhere without realizing it, she had walked into her marriage terrified of becoming a footnote in someone else's story, the way her mother had let her become one, and so she'd started erasing before she could be erased, and hearing that didn't excuse what she'd done. I want to be honest about that. It never fully will, but it helped me understand her, and understanding, I've learned late in my life, is not the same as forgiveness, but it is the road that leads there. And we found forgiveness anyway, slowly, imperfectly, the way most real healing happens, not in one grand dramatic gesture but in 1,000 small ones, a shared recipe, an opened birthday card, a Saturday afternoon with fabric swatches spread across a table, and Michael tells me now that his marriage feels lighter than it has in years, that he no longer feels like he's choosing between the 2 women he loves most, and Robert's ring still hangs above Willow's bed in that little glass, fronted pocket. And last week she pointed at it, and asked her mother to tell her the story again, the story of Grandpa Robert and the blanket Grandma made, and the day everything almost fell apart, and Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed and told it to her, gently, honestly, including the hard parts, including her own mistakes, because she said Willow deserves to know that families don't stay whole by pretending nothing ever went wrong. They stay whole by choosing, again and again, to repair what breaks. And as for me, I am 69 now, my hands are worse than ever. Some mornings I can't even open a jar of preserves without help, but I am knitting again slowly, a small blue sweater for the second grandchild Michael and Vanessa are expecting this winter, and this time there is no secret hidden inside it. No pocket soon shut, because I don't need to hide love anymore in this family. I can hand it over freely, openly, trusting that it will be received the way it was always meant to be, held, valued, kept, and if you take one thing from everything I've shared with you over these past weeks, let it be this, that even the deepest wounds between the people we love are not always endings. Sometimes they are simply the place where the real story finally begins. And sometimes the thing thrown away in anger or fear or misunderstanding becomes, against every odd, the very thing that stitches a broken family back together. One honest conversation, one small act of grace, one shared afternoon of yarn and tea and truth at a time.